Richmond. Are you guys able to hear me? Sounds like it. I like the new music loop. I hope you guys do as well. The old one sounded like it was having a bandwidth problem. So today we're going to talk about a perennial favorite, stem cells. Stem cells are very exciting. You know, everybody, you approach a stem cell thought with, you know what, if I could just grow new cartilage, or if I could just grow a new artery wall, or if I could just grow new components of my heart, then, you know, that would be great. And then, so once stem cells became available, they started, a lot of docs just started injecting them with the hope that the body would know which tissues were injured and how to replace them. Sometimes it does, but most of the time, just like other things, it's not that simple. And we'll get into some issues with stem cells and diabetes for our program today. They've actually used stem cells with diabetes in the past. The thing that wasn't so simple then was, you know what? The stem cells just came in. They developed the beta cell. The beta cell was making insulin, but it was making insulin whether the body needed it or not. Well, obviously that's not going to work, because if your blood sugar is 70 or 60 or lower, you don't want your beta cells making more insulin and pumping them into the blood. So that was the control issue. There's new developments, and we're going to talk about the new developments in terms of control today. Previous topics that we've covered, saturated fats, that turned out to be a very popular topic. So did fiber and reducing plaque buildup. I mean, that's the biggest topic on this channel. The idea that you can actually reverse arterial plaque. Now, is that a practical goal for everybody? No, not really. But it is a practical goal for everybody to realize and think, even if I have plaque, I can certainly stabilize it. That is not that big of a push. And as you see from the science, stabilized plaque is almost as good as having no plaque at all. But bottom line is, you can also reverse it. Nitric oxide was popular as well, and that was no surprise, given all of the stuff about nitric oxide that people are interested in. So we've got a couple of webinars. Michelle's done a lot of good work getting the webinars ready. We had a couple of them last week, a insulin resistance inflammation webinar, and a webinar on plaque. We used to call it the CIMT webinar. Then we realized most of the folks that come into our channel, as in probably a little over half, come to our channel and come to be seen by me as a patient because they got a positive calcium score, or they had a cardiac event and they were just looking up, how do I reverse this plaque in my arteries? Again, as we said, number one, you can do it, but before you do that, you need to know that you have plaque. So there's good ways to find out whether you have plaque, and then there's not so good ways. As happens with a lot of things in medicine these days, the tendency is to use the not so good ways to evaluate plaque, like stress test. You know, with a stress test, you're just not going to get an understanding of heart attack and stroke risk. Well, that's understandable if you understand how the stress test actually works. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. But again, there are good ways to measure plaque, and there are bad ways. Regarding webinars, we've got the supplements webinar coming up soon. It's been supplements have been a big issue. I started in this space, 5-10 years ago, with the idea that, you know what, I leaned more towards that belief that supplements were really expensive urine. But there was so much interest around these things, and I started going back and actually looking at the science. And the science is pretty clear. No, it's true, and this is where some of that Supplements make expensive urine. This is where that comes from. The fact that you can't outrun a lifestyle. You can't out supplement a lifestyle problem. But you know what? You can't out medicate a lifestyle problem, and you can't out stent or bypass a lifestyle problem. If you've got a lifestyle problem, you need to deal with it. But the bottom line is the scientific evidence is clear that supplements do help at the right place and the right time. So again, there's maybe some over expectations by a lot of people regarding supplements, but there's too little use and understanding of supplements as well. We get into that in the upcoming webinar. The saga of the book. I tell you what, this is my first book. I've published quite a bit, but it's all been in scientific literature. That, just like everything else, getting a publishing science is not as simple as a lot of people might think, and getting a book out there is not as simple as people might think either. The major topic of this book is a topic that, again, is a very important one for this channel. Number one, knowing that you can reverse your heart attack and stroke risk. You can even reverse plaque. But number two, knowing that, first of all, you got to figure out if you have plaque, and if so, how much. Like we said, one of the worst, by far the most common way of evaluating plaque is the worst, and that is looking at a stress test. And this book goes into the details of how to evaluate plaque and the problems associated with relying on a stress test. Monthly subscription plans, those are starting to heat up now. And there's a couple of different levels, the silver membership, gold membership, and they vary by obviously the benefits that are available with them. Now, to the topic for today. You want to give us the water ball aspect? So the interesting study came out recently about stem cells and diabetes. As I mentioned, in previous studies, scientists successfully transformed stem cells into the beta cells, or the insulin-producing cells of the pancreas. But they ran into problems. As I said, things are not so simple as we'd like. The stem cells were making insulin whether the body needed it or not. So that's a non-starter. So there's a new study coming out in Stem Cell Reports, came out recently. It looked at tweaking this. How do we get the body, how do we develop stem cells into beta cells that actually respond to the need from the body? They transplanted, it was a complicated 6-step process, which we won't go into in terms of how they prepared these, transformed these stem cells into beta cells that actually respond, but they actually got a response. They transplanted these new cells into mice that could not produce insulin. The cells began secreting the hormone within a few days, and better yet, they helped control the animal's blood sugar, and it worked for months. We've been able, here's a quote from Dr. Milliman, assistant professor of medicine and biomedical engineering who was involved in the study. We've been able to overcome a major weakness in the way these cells previously had been developed. The new insulin-producing cells react more quickly and appropriately when they encounter glucose. The cells behave much more like beta cells in people who don't have diabetes. And for those of you who are into science and getting geeky with some of the information, here's some charts, graphs, nice pictures, which go into more detail on how they actually prepared the beta cells. So let's go back and talk about diabetes for a second and further complications that I see with this. I don't think it's gonna be a massive world impacting cure at this point. And why? let's get into the details. Diabetes affects about 30 million people in the US. That's full-blown diabetes. Prediabetes affects a lot more. Diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the US. And again, that's a very restrictive definition of the term. That's finding it on the death certificate. That doesn't include things like the #1 cause of death, heart attack, #1 cause of disability, stroke, and the #1 cause of both of them as being prediabetes. So it doesn't include all of that. People with type 1 diabetes don't produce insulin. Now, so here's where we start to get into some of the detail of the mechanism of disease and the difference. The reality is type 1 diabetes is a very different disease from type 2 diabetes. People with type 1 diabetes don't produce insulin due to loss of beta cells. Quite often that's because their immune system has, their beta cells have received friendly fire. Their own immune system has wiped out their beta cells. And quite often that's due to a cross reaction from another problem, another infection or something like that, foreign body. The immune system attacks and destroys these insulin-producing cells in the pancreas, those beta cells. People with type 2 diabetes, again, very different type of disease, very different type of disease mechanism. That starts with people not responding to insulin. So they don't wipe out their beta cells. Their insulin receptors in the other cells of the body don't respond to insulin. So the beta cells put out insulin and the blood sugar doesn't drop as it should. Why? Because those insulin receptors aren't responding to that insulin receptors. Where are those insulin receptors? They're in the cell membrane of the liver and muscle cells. So they just lose beta cell function as a result of burnouts. And that burnout comes, well, okay, we didn't get the drop in blood glucose, even though we put out insulin. So we'll put out more insulin and more until we get the reaction that we want to see. I saw a patient yesterday who had a relatively good glucose values on the OGTT, the oral glucose tolerance test, but he had to get way up, close to 150 insulin at peak in order for his body to maintain those low blood glucose values when it was challenged in the OGTT, the oral glucose tolerance test. The beta cells then, as you can see, are overworked due to insulin resistance. You know, the fact that he could get up to 150 on his insulin values during that peak demonstrated that he's not had this problem for 2 decades. Had he had the problem for 2 decades, he wouldn't be able to produce that kind of insulin. So again, as you begin to delve deeper into managing type 2 diabetes, you begin to understand some subtleties of how this disease works. So that individual, for example, if we can do some things to improve the sensitivity of his insulin receptors so his pancreas and his beta cells are not overworking, hopefully we can prevent this problem from turning into just an inability to make insulin. Hopefully we can prevent that pancreatic cell, beta cell burnout that will come in 10 years if he continues to go along this same path. Beta cells are overworked due to insulin resistance. Insulin receptors in the liver and muscle cells are just not responding properly to the insulin and are not pulling the glucose out of the blood. Now, here's the thing. This new development in this study I think might be a bigger development for people with type 1 diabetes, because the primary problem there is, again, the body has nuked out the beta cells. It isn't that you've got decreased sensitivity of insulin. It isn't that you have insulin resistance. So again, it might be a bigger deal for people with type 1 diabetes. That's only 5 to 10% of the people with diabetes. The bigger population of diabetes is the type 2 diabetics. And as we've said, of the people with diabetes, 90% to 95 have type 2. And for every person that has type 2, there's at least 10 other people that have prediabetes. Again, it's that type 2 mechanism, that insulin resistance mechanism. So the vast majority of us are approaching diabetes or prediabetes from an insulin resistance problem, not so much from a primary problem associated with burnout of our beta cells. So clinical trials would have to, is it going to work? Is it going to be a cure? Well, first of all, you have to have clinical trials. Scientists would need to develop a way to test these things safely in people. And let me go back and just make a quick comment about stem cells and some of the research that's happened. I mean, you hear stories about people that docs have just injected stem cells in the face for cosmetic reasons and ended up growing cartilage in eyelids, where they were having a click whenever they blinked. So you have to be careful and make sure that this is safe first. So we're going to need to, probably they're going to be looking at a much more differentiated cell rather than a root undifferentiated stem cell. Probably they're going to be looking at cells that have gone through that 6-step differentiation process. Now, if that gets successful, Millman and his team can mass produce a lot. They can create more than 1 billion beta cells in just a few weeks. So again, there is some hope there. Even so, though, if the stem cells do work, the beta cells will likely be doomed to continue with overwork and burnout until we figure out a way to improve the insulin sensitivity. Stem cells may sound exciting, but as I said, I doubt it's going to be a long-term reliable cure. We still have to target the main problem, insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity. Carl, you want to give us the video?
As we know, the immune system attacks the beta cells in people who have type 1 diabetes. The beta cells are the insulin-producing cells that we have in our organ in the pancreas. And what we would like to do is we would like to generate more of these cells because we know that this is the main problem that they are facing.
There's a certain amount of plasticity in cells. And even a cell that has a single function like the beta cell can over time change. During embryonic development, that happens a lot. So you start out with a single cell, the egg, fertilized egg, which then divides into multiple cells. And then those cells begin to take on specialized forms. So eventually you get cells that make up the eye or the brain or the liver or the pancreas. And then on top of that, even after a cell is sort of specialized into a functional cell like a beta cell or a liver cell or a brain cell, those cells are still not static. And there are certain circumstances in which they can themselves change into another cell type as well.
We can now take cells from our skin or from other places in the body that we can easily access, and we turn them into stem cell equivalents. It allows us to rebuild things that in type 1 diabetic patients are broken.
This is really the core of what regenerative medicine is about now, is to try to get cells in a very controlled and directed way to form a particular tissue or cell type that you need.
To generate something from scratch hasn't been achieved, but we're getting very, very close in doing this.
So there we go. Mike Talley, stem cells are amazing. And as you might guess, and you saw from our little placeholder, we're starting the Q&A section. We're out of the main program and into Q&A. C-Sla, Noise, not sure what that means. Maybe you meant nice. William Powell, Chattanooga, Tennessee. Keto Carnivore. Thanks, William, for sharing that with us. Yes, and I was just saying, yes, stem cells, very interesting topic. Dave Murphy is joined with O2 sat of 97 and 61 beats per minute. So obviously Dave's looking pretty good this morning. Good morning to you. And here we go. All glucose, morning glucose was 80 and ketones were 3.7. Extremely happy about that. Dave has shared with the group that he's been involved with the keto, Dr. Oz's keto group, and has been very, very satisfied, very happy with what he's done in that space. And it looks like it's done him a heck of a lot of good. C-Sly, yep. Okay. Listening here in Brazil. Welcome from Brazil. Thank you for letting us know that know where you're coming from. We've got, actually, we're developing a group of followers in Brazil. Robert Simpson, good morning. Dave Murphy, Michelle does a lot of great work. Thanks, Michelle. Conventional docs are like taking your car to the mechanic with a check engine light. He opens the hood and says, yep, you have an engine. Not really diagnosing the actual problem. Thank you so much, Dave. Yeah, unfortunately, we do have too much of that. Not enough of a deep look at the root cause, and that's a problem in medicine. It's just a huge, huge problem. It's a buyer beware type of environment, and that's the last environment because of the stakes. Two things. Number one, the stakes are really high. It's your body, your health. And number two, it's very complicated. So unfortunately, one of the most important areas to not have a buyer beware kind of marketplace, you've got one, is one of the worst buyer beware marketplaces. Joe, time 11:10. I don't know if you were saying we got started a little bit late. We did. We had Carl got booted out of StreamYard, and we had to get Carl back in before we got started. So thanks for your patience, if that's what your comment was. Good on you, Syed Australia, Wally Sarkar. Thank you, Syed. Good morning, Joe. Good morning, Robert. Time 11:19. Oh, okay. So here's what Joe's doing. And thanks for the reminder. So Joe, number one, there's a couple of issues. Number one, there's a YouTube and Facebook program delays into the loops. So that's required for operational reasons. The other thing is, as I mentioned before, when we start getting a lot of active comments, there becomes a little bit of pressure on that list to start popping up. And Joe sent me a text after one of our recent live events, and he said, look, you skipped about 10 minutes worth of comments. And I said, sorry about that. And that does happen. I'll click on the next one, and instead of hitting the next one, it'll file up for about, whatever it wants to file up in terms of getting comments there. So thank you again for your help, Joe. Joe said, you know what, I'll give you some time stamps and we'll see if that actually works. So we'll try it. Dave Murphy, I approached my orthopedic surgeon about stem cell therapy. That was his concern. How to get the stem cell to produce the type of cell you want and not some rogue cell. That was a year ago. And yep, so they're different. I mean, this whole thing of stem cells is, I've got a series, probably about a half dozen videos that go into the details about stem cells and some of the challenges. That's one of the challenges. Now, another challenge is how to make your way through the scientific evidence. If you start looking at the science surrounding stem cells, we don't have good standards yet. They haven't been developed. So, it's like walking on lily pads. Every time you try to get a footing, a basis from which to start comparing things, your footing just collapses beneath you because, again, one group is using this type of stem cell product, another one's using a totally different product. even if they're using the same product, they're not using the same type and the same number of cells per milliliter, the same dosages, looking at different reasons. And so you multiply all those complications by the fact that they're looking at stem cells for everything from cosmetic purposes to cancers to, again, heart transplants. I did a video, gosh, a couple of years ago, where they're actually making progress in terms of making stem cells for heart cells. So, you know, the idea there is obviously, well, dang, somebody that's had a heart attack or somebody that's got massive heart failure with a huge heart, can we go back and replace those cells in the heart? They actually made progress in that area. Now, guess where that problem happened? Now, guess what the problem was with those heart cells? They actually started making heart cells from stem cells long ago. Here's what they couldn't do. It was the function issue. They couldn't get them to beat, or if they were beating, they weren't beating in a coordinated fashion. And actually, they made a lot of progress, again, a couple of years ago on developing a way to differentiate stem cells back into heart cells that would actually start beating. And they said it was very interesting to watch these stem cells being differentiated in the test tubes, in the petri dishes, and you could actually start seeing a mechanism where these cells started beating in unison, in a rhythm. Very, very interesting. David Forgerson, if insulin is a primary cause of atherosclerosis in people with type 2 diabetes, then people with type 1 diabetes should have virtually no atherosclerosis. Is that the case? Not at all the case. And here's the other reason, David. High blood sugar is also a major cause of atherosclerosis. Do we know the exact mechanism? Again, I'm going to go down a bunny hole. People have been telling me to take a look at this recent interview with Ivor Cummins. A lot of folks that watch my channel watch Ivor's and vice versa. Dr. Sabatin, who's a pathologist, and he pointed out that rather than finding that deposition of LDL close to the intima, the lining, they were finding it originally out further in towards the edge of the artery wall. His theory was maybe this was all coming from the vasa vasorum. That just means the vessels of the vessels. And what is that? That's a microscopic vessel that provides blood supply to the blood vessel, the artery wall. I know that's starting to sound like a sci-fi movie or a logic problem, but here's the bottom line. If I didn't get quite as many surprises from that video as maybe a lot of people did. We've always known that vasa vasorum do play a major role in terms of the development of plaque. What we don't know yet, and still don't know, even looking at Subatin's theory, his theory is that no, they're not a passive part. They're not a reaction to the development of the plaque. This growth of the vasa vasorum may actually be a primary cause. Could be. Bottom line, here's the thing. It gets away from whether the vasa vasorum are causative or a cause or a reaction. The bottom line is I would clearly agree with this statement that it's not LDL concentration that's causing that plaque. Is that LDL getting through because of damage to the intima? I think we would agree with that. And if you listened carefully, you heard the term transcytosis. I did a video on transcytosis. The guys at University of Texas Southwest demonstrated that. It was about a year ago, where what transcytosis means is this. blocking, or trans means across, and then cytosis means the cell. So it was actually demonstrating that you didn't have to have holes in the endothelium. What you had was a mechanism where the endothelial cell, the intimus cell, was actually transporting LDL from one side of that cell to the other, from the blood area over into the artery wall. So whether or not Subbotin's theory is actually going to end up being the proof, whether or not it becomes proven, again, I think we all are focused on that, some of the same issues: injury to the artery wall. Now, how did I get down that bunny hole? Because David Ferguson asked, well, if type 1 diabetics aren't making insulin, and insulin causes this inflammation, then type 1 diabetics shouldn't have plaque. Again, not at all true, and here's why. It's not just insulin, it's high blood sugar. So thank you for those of you that made it through that digression, for your patience and interest. Dave Murphy, plus, as it's an experimental procedure, insurance won't cover it. Very cost prohibitive. Yeah. So orthopedists obviously are looking at injecting stem cells into things like knees to replace torn cartilage in knees. And yes, again, until we get, as a culture and as a group, until the physicians begin to understand exactly how to redirect stem cells to create the kind of cells that are missing or injured, then we're going to continue to be in this soup of uncertainty and frustration. Syed Australia, Wali Sakar, how far away from stem cells we are? Yeah, let me put that in a Star Wars kind of. Somebody fact check me. I'm having a senior moment. There was a guy in Star Wars that used to put his verbs at the end. Yeah, we're a long way from getting stem cells to actually be a functional thing. Now, stem cells are functioning in some areas, but again, here's the thing, Syed. There's so many areas where we want them to work. Even if you look at a tiny slice of where we would like to see stem cells working, diabetes, as you began to see during the presentation today, it's just not that simple. There are two very, very different types of diabetes. One is type 1 diabetes, the other is type 2. And the impact of stem cells on these two is very likely to be totally different. Again, I think most of us would have more hope for stem cell treatment of type 1 diabetes being impacted, having a positive impact much more quickly than type 2. So, Syed, I know I didn't answer your question. My point is there's no easy answer to that question. Mike Talley, medical industry doesn't want to cure anything. You know, I used to think that that was a very negative view, but as I get older, I began to realize that, you know what, I've been somewhat naive. A lot of people in the medical industry don't want people to get well. That's true, unfortunately, very unfortunate. Okay, we just had one of those moments where okay, here we go. Phil Roberts, Dr. Roberts, down in Nashville. Stem cells are great. Concentrated growth factors, previously known as exosomes, are even more potent. Thank you so much. Phil's doing a lot of work in that space right now. He and I have actually talked about the potential of getting something up and rolling. I've got so many things going on right now that I haven't quite made it yet across the finish line on getting things up and rolling with stem cells or exosomes. Joe, the time tracking is 11:25. Joe's O2 SAT is 97 and 73 beats per minute, so he's looking good. Gene Callahar, are they doing actual stem cell experimentation on type 1 diabetics at this time? Obviously on laboratory animals for sure, but as we mentioned in there, there's quite a few hoops they're going to have to get over. One of the first and biggest is proving safety before they start active treatment trials, randomized clinical trials. Dave Murphy, oh, thank you, Dave. A super chat. And as you can see, Aspen and Carl have the directions. If you're interested in doing a super chat or a PayPal, they're up in the right and left-hand corner right over. Let me see if I can make that there for PayPal and there for super chat. I feel like a weatherman trying to get. This is the super. Well, the one up in the far right-hand corner is the super chat. It's right next to the comment section. Thank you again, Dave, for your interest and all you've done to support the channel and the practice. He's mentioning getting his tests scheduled. I think he's shared with us that he's doing some work with us. Syed Australia, I'm so excited about stem cell research. I hope one day scientists will bring happiness in our face. I am type 2 diabetic patient. I'm excited for that too, Syed, but here's the thing. I would say don't hold your breath. Don't wait for that. Make sure that you're doing anything and everything you can to manage your own type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, insulin resistance. And we already know there's a ton of things that we can do. We say, well, genetics loads the gun. I can't overcome genetics, et cetera, et cetera. Well, here, the second part of that statement is genetics may load the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger. And that's the kind of work that I do all day, every day with patients and viewers in terms of helping them understand what are the specific triggers in terms of lifestyle that we can do to help you even reverse your plaque or certainly stabilize it. And that involves very much managing that type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. So thanks for the comments, Syed. Chuck K, hi, Doc. Looking forward to our meeting this morning. This new health journey has turned into a real hobby. Well, thank you so much, Chuck. I'm looking forward to it as well. I think, anyhow, I will, hopefully we'll see you soon. And yes, you know what, to Chuck's other comment, this new health journey has turned into a real hobby. It does turn into a hobby, and it does require making some changes. Just the whole change of beginning to manage your carbs in your diet, assuming you're one of the majority of us middle-agers getting pre-diabetic, that takes time. That takes focus, and it takes a month or two to start wrapping your head around all the different things that you need to do. But once you make those changes, it's not that big of a deal. Just ask anybody who's been there. Gene Callahar, have you any thoughts on why type 1 often jump a generation? That's a really interesting question, Gene, and I don't. Gene's talking about the fact that you do tend to see a genetic predisposition for type 1. I'm not so sure that it really does jump generations. It might. It clearly, I mean, you clearly see some generation jumping, but the question is there a genetic mechanism in there that's driving that, and other than random? And I'm not so sure that it is. I'm really not. See, there's so many other things. Gene, now that you bring up the genetics, I got to just mention a comment about epigenetics. They've already proven in laboratory models, laboratory animals, this is not the mother, this is the father. Well, let's talk about the mother first. And we know that from human observation as well as animal models. I'm an example. I'm a poster child for it. I was born at 10.5 pounds. My mother had some significant prediabetes when I was in utero. And guess what? Despite the fact that I did a lot of things right in terms of managing my my health, 57 years later, after I'm born, I'm developing significant prediabetes. That's epigenetics. It's not so much what was in my genetic code, but it was what had been planted in the genetic mechanisms, in my methylome. If you haven't heard that term, look it up. In fact, you can Google on YouTube, Ford Brewer methylome, and you'll see several videos in this space, all involving the genetics and epigenetics. The methylome, here's epigenetics. So if you look at 6 billion base pairs, you got to have a really good librarian to find the right genetic, the right genes for the right activity at the right time. And what they found, there's a company called Illumina. They're very deep into this space, and they were a significant pioneer in terms of actually developing what's called the methylome, because they found out that this librarian that's finding these genes out of all these, these 23 chromosomes and these, 23 pairs of chromosomes, the 6 billion base pairs, all that business. So they found that that librarian uses methylation of specific gene areas in order to create the, for those of us who are middle-aged, that old library card catalog, in order to organize and manage those genes. Well, again, I've gone down some little bunny holes regarding methylation and genetics of diabetes. Let me just make one more comment, and then we'll go back to the questions and answers. So that's mother, and that's the child. If the child is over 8.5 pounds when they're born, they're very likely to have prediabetes as we get older. I was 10.5 pounds. So despite the fact that I had a BMI in the low 20s, by the time I was in my late 50s, I still had significant challenges with prediabetes. That's the mother, that's the child. Even with the father, what they've shown with laboratory animals, now haven't really, it should be easy enough to create this research and go back and look at it. But with laboratory, in humans, I haven't seen it yet. I have seen it with laboratory animals. They've proven that if the father is obese at the time of conception, there's greatly increased risk for diabetes for the offspring. So you're right, Gene, there's a lot of interesting stuff in terms of the genetics, primary genetics for type 1, and big issues around epigenetics for type 2 diabetes. Thank you for the question, and thanks to the rest of you for your interest. Dave Murphy, a little disappointed in my primary care practitioner. She was the one that got me to do the coronary artery calcium score that identified the issues, but then appears to have no clue what to do about it, or if of the real root causes. Dave, thanks for putting that out there. As we've shown, there's research about that. I mean, if you can Google my videos in terms of why doesn't my doctor understand prediabetes. There's tons of research where they've just shown doctors don't understand prediabetes for a whole bunch of reasons. They think they do, but they think that, you know what, I'm not going to cover prediabetes because my patient's not going to respond to me anyway. So, you know, the docs are blaming the patients in turn blame the docs. I've worked with both groups, and it's an unfortunate thing. One thing I can say is my kudos out to you guys. I've got several doctors. I had some doctor patients this week and last week. We've had some of those doctor patients join us and mention that they were docs and patients. Kudos to the docs that are investigating and learning about this. Kudos to you as the patients, because it's even harder for the patients that don't have a background in this space to learn what you need to learn in order to prevent your heart attack and stroke. So Dave, you're clearly one of them. Kudos to you, and thanks for what you do. Joe, timestamp 11:30. Dave Murphy, did I understand Sabatin to say the intima actually thickens over time? Yes, you did. And I was unaware of that. He talked about the intima in the, I think the coronary arteries, and was it in the aorta? I'm not so sure. The intima in a couple of areas, thickening routinely as a quote normal over time. Yeah, David, yeah, that's right. Thank you so much. We obviously had a commenter whose English was a second language, and we were making a play on that because, again, the time for reliable treatment by stem cells, a long way off it is. And yeah, that's the way Yoda would say that. Ben Caraballo, stem cells don't work. They have not in me in 1 year, lower back and right knee. Thanks for sharing that, Ben. And here's the issue. Like I said, as long as we're just making guesses and we don't really understand the evidence behind the science, and as long as we can't develop that evidence in the science, that's exactly what's going to happen. They're going to not work, and even worse, create things that cause danger. Joe Riley put in a super chat for $9.99. Thank you so much. Again, these may seem like small contributions to you guys, but they really do add up, and they make a big difference. In order to manage our costs, we've done a lot of work with offshoring. Carl, Aspen, the team live on Filipino dollars, so $9.99 is a big deal in terms of that Filipino economic triage. Ben Carabello, most likely it won't work on my type 2 diabetes. I agree. I think most likely, if anybody were to go out and find a doc who would do those, there's a lot of questions right now about what they're going to create. As we mentioned, we had a comment from Dr. Phil Roberts, who's working on this. Phil, if you have any, Phil's got a lot of clinical trials going on in stem cell space. Phil, you may want, or at least exosomes. Phil, if you've got any clinical trials going on in that space, let us know. Okay, let's see. We may have. Let's see where we were. I think I might have gotten this lost here. Okay. Ben Caraballo, even a 90-day liquids-only fasting does not work. For those of you who didn't pick up on Ben's comment, I think what Ben is saying is it's been demonstrated. Walter Longo and others who've done a lot of work in terms of fasting have demonstrated that fasting is a natural way to stimulate stem cell growth and replenishment. And they've demonstrated multiple times that you start getting your own internal stem cells growing after you go through a significant fasting period, and then you start that refeeding. But actually, there was some pretty good evidence that he had significant improvement in diabetes and prediabetes. Again, that was some of Walter Longo's work. So I think that may have been what Ben was referring to. Dave Murphy, absolutely. Lifestyle pulls the trigger. When with your assistance and guidance, I will reverse my plaque and calcium. It may take time, but I will make it happen. Well, I'll tell you what, thanks again for those comments and that support, Dave. I'm going to remind people of a comment that you made a few weeks ago. 135 pounds. You don't just decide to lose 135 pounds. That has been a major, major accomplishment on your part. And yes, once you get over once you start getting over weight loss of 20, 30 pounds like that, those are the kind of places where you do tend to see significant reversal of plaque. Ben Carabello, 25 years of this dreaded illness, numbers always in the 200s, 600 highest. Not a carb abuser either. Sorry to hear that, Ben. That is a major challenge. Be interested to hear and see what you are doing in terms of other issues, medications, things like that. Jean Callahar, grandmother with type 2, mother, no diabetes, grandmother with type 1. Any thoughts? Yeah. My first reaction, thanks for sharing that, Gene. My first reaction is, I think these are, you go back, I think there's some random event stuff going on here. I don't think the grandmother with type 1 is that much, oh, okay. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. You're saying you got a grandmother on one side with type 2 and a grandmother on the other side with type 2, but a mother with no diabetes. And maybe you're saying you've got it. Again, here's the question. I'm trying to put these two together. Are you saying that you have type 1 despite the fact that your mother did not and your grandmother did? Let me just say this. So here's part of what happens with there's a Russian roulette factor in terms of any of the inflammatory diseases, diabetes being one of them. So if you look at, oh gosh, I'm going to go into that area where we do bad drawings on the on pieces of wavy paper. So if you look at an antibody, I don't know how well you can see this. If you look at an antibody, there are components. The whole antibody, this area is the part that latches on to the foreign body. And you have to have some variation in these areas in order to, because a flu vaccine, a flu antibody is going to be different from the antibody of, a bacteria, which is going to be different from another antigen. So you start, in order for your immune system to start making these things, they have these areas of the antibody, the proteins that are the same, always the same. But then they have variation out here. Well, how does your body create these variation areas that will actually match to the antigen, whether it's a flu or a bacteria or whatever? There's a Russian roulette component to it. There's some random generator components, and your body's just in a mode, your immune system's just in a mode of saying, okay, I'll make a bunch of random antibodies. And when I find one that matches this antigen, well, let's say it's the flu, then I've got a mechanism where I'll go back and repeat and make millions and millions of these same antibodies that happen to work with that flu. Why did I go down that bunny hole? Here's why. Because with the cross reaction, sometimes you get people that are making antibodies that may match here for the flu or a virus, but they also match for that individual's own beta cell. That's where you get this friendly fire concept, this cross reactivity problem. So what has that got to do with you and type 1 and your grandmothers? So again, type 1, the one where you get this nuking of your, or burning up of your beta cell primarily, that tends to happen more from this mechanism. So did you inherit similar types of Russian roulette random patterns from that type 1 grandmother? That's very possible. Now, why wouldn't your mother get it? Again, there's still a lot of random activities that have to happen on a regular basis for you to actually get the disease. So your mother may have developed antibodies to the same viruses, the same foreign objects, but she ended up using a different component. She may still have some of those potential risk factors, some of those same potential protein areas, but from the roulette card, from the random mechanism, they didn't happen to use the same antibodies. So maybe they got a little bit too theoretical, too out there, but hopefully it helped you understand why it's very possible and even likely that even a genetic problem like that can skip a generation, at least for this type of issues. There are other reasons why genetics can skip generations, but this is this was specific to this. Ben Carabello, my BMI is 20, born at close to 10 pounds. So Ben, I'm assuming from what you're saying and what you've said before, maybe I missed something, but it sounds like type 2 diabetes problems. And yep, you know, it's just like you're saying, you like me were, you know, at your birth weight created some epigenetic risk here. 11:45. Thank you so much, Joe. Joe, to your point, I'll go back and make this. I don't when you and I talked, I didn't remember seeing the timestamps, but I do see a timestamp here. My only problem now is knowing. See the timestamp. I'm at 11:45 now, and you won't see this until, you know, the actual time is more like 11:57 right now. So, Joe, again, I appreciate the idea, but because of the lag in terms of the natural, 8 to 24 second lag that you see with YouTube publication, and the lag that we have in terms of getting to the comments, I don't know whether, I'm skeptical that that's going to work. Syed, Australia, here are easy ways to lower blood sugars naturally. Exercise regularly. Exactly. And I would add, it's not just one type of exercise. There are 3 different components: aerobic, high intensity interval training, and resistance training. And all of them are very important. Not a single one of them. They're all very different. You know, aerobics is, you can do with walking, and walking alone is a big, big deal. But if you don't get that resistance training, you start losing muscle mass, which takes you down that inflammatory pathway that so many 65-year-old and olders die from. High intensity interval training has been shown to have a huge impact in this area. Control your carb intake on a daily basis. That is a big deal. I've got plenty of patients in my practice that that came to me from YouTube channel that have not only prediabetes, they've got full-blown diabetes with blood sugars. Once you challenge them up 250, 300, 350, but on a regular basis, after losing a little bit of body fat and managing those carbs, hardly ever get over 120. So yes, there are a lot of things that you can do to manage this problem. Increase fiber intake. We talked about fiber a couple of videos ago, and that's one of our more popular replays right now. Drink water and stay hydrated. So Jean Kalahar, thank you, Syed. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Jean Kalahar, previous question, mistake equals daughter with type 1 diabetes. Well, still, I mean, trying to place all those together, a little bit confused, but hopefully the example and discussion help. And fasting, yes, Shwandeep Singh, fasting is a very important mechanism for health. Most people thought it was a bunch of airhead, crazy internet doctors talking about fasting for the longest time, but I believe it was the day after Christmas. No matter how conservative your doctor is, very few doctors are going to argue with stuff that makes it through the gauntlet of review to get published in the New England Journal, especially a review article. And I believe, again, it was the day after Christmas. I did a video on it in the New England Journal. There was a review on intermittent fasting, making the point that just intermittent fasting, which most people interpret as skipping breakfast, just intermittent fasting has a huge positive impact on health. Shwarndeep, thank you again for pointing this out. I typically, you know, now that most of our patients come from the YouTube channel, I get a lot of people that have lost over 30 pounds. And they tell me time and time and time again, well, what happened was I dropped my carbs. When I dropped my carbs, I quit getting into this roller coaster of hunger. And the other thing I did was I closed my eating window, or the most common term is did intermittent fasting, and the most common interpretation is skipping breakfast. And people were losing weight like crazy with that simple activity. I have always encouraged people to do some trials of fasting mimicking diet and or prolonged fasting, fasting 24 or 48 hours or more. I don't get quite as many takers on those last two, but again, huge population impact on intermittent fasting and prediabetes and health. Ben Carabello, $12,000 waste of money. Could have bought a lot of cookies. Yeah, you could have bought a lot of cookies, all right. Well, you know what? Maybe it wasn't a waste. 1150. Diabetes is a slow death sentence. 150 pounds. Oh, that's right, David. So what David is saying is he's correcting me. He didn't lose 135, lost 150 from his highest weight. Over 100 in the last 16 months. Huge impact on your health, Dave, no question. 7 more pounds to go. Thanks for your help and support, and thank you again, Dave, for yours. Ben Carabello, have you read Dr. Richard Bernstein's book, Diabetes Solutions? It may have some beneficial information for you. It is. Richard Bernstein, the father of diabetes self-care. Long story about him. As an engineer with significant, severe, brittle diabetes, his wife was an ER doc. She brought home this 7-pound gizmo that they had invented to start looking at blood sugar. He started using it, started writing articles, couldn't get it published, went to med school to start getting his articles published. At least that was the story. And ended up becoming, again, the father of diabetes self-care. Ben Carabello, metformin 1 gram per day, Triceba 20 milligrams, also the one injected. Okay, so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I mentioned earlier to Ben when he was talking about his lifestyle issues, I was wondering what kind of medication component he was on, and clearly a lot of the right ones. Time 11:55. So as you see, that was 8 minutes ago, Joe. Grandmother, mother, sister, type 2, got it at age 40. Sorry, I have to leave. Thank you for your interest, Ben. Skunk Ape, any recommendations for atorvastatin dosage? 3 stents, 52 years old, have an average diet, and is plaque reversible from the cholesterol medication? Actually, those of you who are statin haters, close your ears. Cholesterol medications, statins are one of the more common ways of documenting decreased plaque. Do they do it by decreasing cholesterol? I don't think so. I think it's clear. When you have soft plaque, what you've got is there's a liquid component there. And that liquid component, let me see if I have, I don't think I do. Soft plaque is a liquid, and it's got a lot of inflammatory cells, inflammatory components. The statins tend to decrease that inflammation, and when you decrease that inflammation, you get a lot of that liquid out of that plaque, that soft plaque, and it hardens, it calcifies. I don't use atorvastatin. It doesn't quite have, it will decrease your LDL, your cholesterol, but it doesn't tend to have as much of an impact. It does have impact, but not as much on inflammation, especially if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, or if you're a female. Well, I mean, that's the vast majority. I mean, if you're a female, that's only half of us, but if you're pre-diabetic, that's another, what, 80%, 90%? So I tend not to use those. The other thing is I tend to use low-dose statins, because the low-dose statins still have an impact on inflammation. You don't usually need high-dose statins to have that impact. The other thing is we're using a lot of Livala or pitavastatin recently, because it doesn't increase your insulin resistance like the other ones do. Syed, fasting is the best solution to prevent all kinds of problems. It's a very good solution, no question. Dave Murphy, yes on the fasting. Currently 70 hours into a 72-hour fast. So David had shared, I mean, David's one of these guys that actually took me up on not only the intermittent fasting, closing that window, watching the carbs, going full-blown keto with Dr. Buys. He's also doing some prolonged fasting on a regular basis. So enjoy the fasting break that you're going to take in a few minutes or a couple of hours. 20 or less total carbs a day when I do eat. Now that's total. That's not net carbs, by the way. Jill England, 50 pounds since December 19. Whoa, you are smoking, Jill. Congratulations, doing a great job. Dave Murphy, Jill England, great job. Thank you for helping us out. That's Simra Basivan. Syed, if we promise to ourselves we start to do fasting at least once a week, we will prevent all the headaches. 1205, thank you so much. We're closing the gap, Joe. Thank you guys for your interest, and we've gone a little bit over an hour. Again, thanks.